Welcome to this Science of Photography tutorial. Within this tutorial we are going to look at apertures within photography, and the learning outcomes for this tutorial include that you will better understand what apertures are, you will have more control over your depth of field, whether it's shallow or broad, and you should be able to minimise distractions with just using depth of field, which improves your aesthetics and it really gets your viewers to look at what you intend them to look at. So the aperture is the opening at the end of the lens, which is very similar to the human eye, where it contracts or closes down the pupil, or it dilates where the pupil gets larger. The aperture does this dilating and contracting action whenever you set your aperture. The apertures live in the lens, not in the camera, but the camera controls the opening and the closing of the aperture. Apertures are expressed as f numbers, for example 8.0. The f in f number means fractional ratio, so the area of the f number opening, i.e. the size of the hole, fits into the circumference of the lens 8 times at f8. So if an aperture was f22, 22 would be a smaller opening, and therefore it would fit into the lens circumference 22 times. But what do apertures do? They have an impact on depth of field within a photograph. The depth of field relates to how much of the scene is in focus from the foreground of the photograph to the background of the photograph. So that would be similar to you standing looking at a scene at this point in time and noticing that the pavement directly in front of you is in focus, and noticing the scene, the mountains, the buildings, the bridge, whatever you happen to be looking at is also in focus in the distance. That would be your broad depth of field, where everything from the pavement to the items way in the distance, that it's all in focus. That is a broad depth of field. So depth of field can be broad, such as a landscape, or depth of field can be shallow, where you're focusing on something much closer and you want to blur out the background. If you use aperture priority within your camera, the aperture priority allows the user to set the f number by deciding whether they want a shallow or a broad depth of field, and the camera compensates the shutter speed for an acceptable exposure. So the aperture priority is a semi-automatic mode that uses reciprocal law, and that simply means that you choose half of the equation and the camera makes up the other half to get a reasonable exposure. So within apertures, you have large apertures and you have small apertures, and you have other apertures going from large to small. And the way that I think about apertures is, if it was a large aperture and I had a paper cup with the bottom cut off it, the liquid would fall out very fast, so that would equal fast shutters. So large apertures have fast shutters. If, however, I had a paper cup with a small hole, which would be akin to a small aperture, the same amount of liquid will come out very slowly because it has a much smaller hole to get through. So small apertures have slower shutters. I've provided an example of this on screen, and as I hover over the different f numbers, and there's a lot going on within this screen, so I want you to look at the camera graphic over to the left hand side first of all. As I move over the f numbers, you can see the aperture in the lens physically getting larger or smaller. Also, while you're on the camera, I would like you to note, if I go from a large aperture such as 5.6 down to a smaller aperture such as f8, it impacts on the shutter speed, which is in the bottom left of the camera graphic. As the aperture gets smaller, the shutter speed gets slower. So if your shutter speed was at 1/500, it's now 1/250. If we open up the aperture, so we're going from f11, which is smaller than f8. So if we go from f11 to f8, we're opening up the aperture, so your shutter speeds should get twice as fast. So there is that doubling and halving of shutter speed, depending on whether you're opening or closing the aperture. The next thing I want you to look at is the image at the bottom right. This is your depth of field, and if we focus on the middle item within the depth of field diagram, you will see that whenever we're on f3.5, that they have a narrow depth of field. So this is your shallow depth of field. Anything that's not inside the two lines will be softly out of focus. The further an item is away from you, the more out of focus it will be. And whenever we go down into smaller apertures such as f11, f16, f22, your depth of field broadens, so you can see the two lines getting much further away from each other, and everything between those will also be in focus. So you're getting more in focus from where the camera ends and where the scene is within the distance. The third thing I would like you to note is the fairy image. As I start at f3.5, you will see that the fairy is in focus, but the background is softly out of focus. It's not detailed, although you can still make it out that it's a tree. And as we go down the apertures, you will see that the background becomes more distinct, more sharp, more focused, and that demonstrates a broad depth of field. So what do we need to consider whenever we're using apertures? We need to consider the distance that our subject is from the camera. If we're doing very close-up photography, we may want to blur the background to lessen the distraction. And with that as well, we're actually drawing the viewer's eyes to the focus, so we're telling them what to look at. This is a very good way to direct your viewer's gaze. If your subject is further away, you'll probably want a broader depth of field. And even if you used a large aperture, simply by focusing on something further away, your depth of field broadens out with distance. It is good practice to use smaller apertures for distance photography, simply because you're looking at a broader depth of field, more sharpness and more detail within the scene. If you're looking to have a foreground item in focus as well as a distant item in focus, you may ask yourself, which item do you focus on? One solution would be to use your hyperfocal distance, i.e. you don't focus on the near item and you don't focus on the far item, but you focus part of the way between the two. And whenever you're focusing, you get a third of the focus in front of the focal point and you get 2/3 of focus after the focal point. So if you were to go 1/3 after the foreground subject and preferably 2/3 before the background subject, that would be your hyperfocal distance, and it should provide a broad enough depth of field to make sure that your foreground and your background is acceptably sharp. For those of you that use manual mode, the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO make up the total exposure. This can be very good, as in an acceptable exposure, or if one part of those three items in the equation aren't right, you could end up with over or under exposure. The camera doesn't calculate any values, it's up to you as the user within the manual mode to know what you're doing. Apertures as F numbers, I'm going to start as F1. And if you can remember F1 as Formula 1 and that Formula 1 cars are fast, hopefully you also remember that F1 equals fast shutter speeds. The F numbers that I'm going to highlight here, I'm going to split into 3 categories. So the first category here would be F1.4, F1.8, F2.8 and F3.5. These apertures would have a very shallow depth of field and would be used for close-up items, possibly macro photography or close-up photography. The second category would be F5.6 and F8.0. I would use these for portrait photography or mid-depth of field photography, which can be quite general. The third category will run from F11.0, F16.0, F22.0, F26.0, F32.0, F36.0, F45.0 and F64.0. This last category is used for distance or far away photography, whether that's landscapes, seascapes, cityscapes, starscapes, etc. Your subject is pretty far away. So with that last category, you will expect to have slower shutter speeds, you will expect to have broader depth of fields, and you may well need to use a tripod. The range of F numbers that I've just highlighted, you will not have them all within one lens. A 50mm prime lens may have f1.4 or f1.8 as its largest aperture, and potentially f22 as its smallest. A standard kit lens will have f3.5 down to f32, and some 70 to 300mm lenses start at f4 and can get down to as small an aperture as f45. So you have ranges of apertures within different lenses available. So within this tutorial we have explained that apertures are openings at the end of the lens. We've also mentioned that aperture relates to depth of field, as in how much is in focus from foreground to background within your photograph, and that shallow depth of field images can be used to minimise distraction and to direct your viewer's gaze within your image. So you're telling them basically what to look at. And we've given an analogy of the paper cups. So 2 paper cups with equal amounts of water, and the water equals your shutter speeds. One paper cup with a large hole in it, the water would whoosh out very quick, so that would be your fast shutter speed. And the second cup with a small hole in it, the water would come out much more slowly, so that would be your slow shutter speed. It's just to try to get you to visualise how your camera works and what's actually happening in the inside. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial, and thanks for helping us science the shot out of photography.